Clint Ramos, costume designer for Respect. What was your first thought when you were asked to join an Aretha Franklin biopic?
What was my first thought? Oh, boy. I think it was one of, disbelief and then just sort of like the gargantuan task of kind of like following that life and that arc, that narrative arc of what is sort of arguably, the biggest musical star of the 20th century. So I think that was, it was overwhelming.
Well, how familiar were you with Aretha before this?
Familiar, I think I think, it would be culturally. I think, my
Yeah,
mother
I mean, we're
played
all
her.
familiar with her music. Yeah.
Right. But I had my mother played a lot of her music, so I kind of knew her from that, and I also experienced her later in her life, and so I was not as before the project. I was not familiar with sort of her backstory and everything, that happened to her in her childhood and all of that.
Mhm. So what did you learn like through your research into her life and like her early childhood and early career that informed how you designed for the film?
Oh, that she was a whole human being. I think that she was complete in a way, and I think there were a lot of like there were struggles, but she also diverges from what is kind of the biased depiction of African American divas. She came from a very genteel family. In when we think of like Aretha, we cannot separate her from the legacy of her family. Her father was a rock star preacher in the African American church and was the mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. And so, I think I, what did I not learn? I think she's a survivor. I think she's a very complex human being, and that sort of the depth of her talent is directly proportional to the depth of her experience, her spiritual, emotional experience.
Mhm. Well, like for like a public figure like her, like obviously she's well photographed. There's like video footage of her, and I think a lot of times you think about like, oh, you have to recreate like the famous iconic looks that everyone knows, but also it's a biopic, so then there's all these moments of her interior, like day-to-day life that were not filmed or photographed. So
Yeah, there was
but
there
like
was
what is harder, like imagining like coming up with original designs for those moments or like recreating like famous moments?
I don't know what's harder for people, but I found the sort of excavation sort of more exciting. The extent, sort of like when you look at the she was not heavily photographed before the Columbia years, clearly. So I had to like exhume a lot of like I had to create that world in a way with Liesl Tommy, our director, and so for me, it's more exciting to actually conjure up what that interior world is, and I think that's where costume design is, shines. It's in that it's a method of storytelling, conjuring up this human being. So I find that um, um, I get consumed by that. The pretty gowns, it's almost it's a science, like you sort of figure out what the effect is, and you go through the making process of it. But there is an anchor to what you're trying to do, but with what she wore when she was down and out, her day wear when she was going through sort of the abuse from her husband, all of that. What was she wearing? And it brings us to sort of the magic of clothing and why we put on what we put on a daily basis. What are we actually trying to say?
And you can see, I mean, her style changes like throughout the decades, but you can see like early on when she was still like under the thumb of her father, it was like more modest and the colors were like a little bit more muted. And then like by like the 70s when she's like in the civil rights era, like she's
Yeah.
full afro and like prints and like more free and wild. So like how did you go into like arcing her style evolution?
I mean, I read a lot
Mhm.
about her, you know, including both authorized and unauthorized biographies, and actually just like really looked at sort of what was extant, you know, a lot of the magazines that she was featured in, and a lot of the interviews that she made, you know. I think she was an independent dresser, you know, and I think she's overlooked as a style icon because she actually dressed according to what she was feeling in a particular period, and also, you know, she kind of she wasn't like her contemporaries like Diana Ross and all the and all of them, and she wasn't a mannequin, you know, she was a real life human being. So if you see photographs of Aretha, you will always find the humanity kind of peeking through, and that's what I loved about that research process. You know, you found sort of a strap kind of like having fallen, you know, a strand of hair. There was no it wasn't about perfection, you know, but what you saw was a living, breathing human being crafted by God, and that's what I, you know, that's what I loved about her, you know.
Mhm. I like the use of the color red because it's like also attached to her mother who died
Yeah.
when she was very young, and then there's a later in the movie she hallucinates her mother when she decides to like sober up. So how did you go about like incorporating that color into her outfits?
Um, Thank you for actually noticing that. I think part of, you know, the early discussions with the production designer and with Liesl Tommy, our director, was trying to figure out color palettes, and I found it always kind of interesting when we try to conjure up a palette for a real life, right? Like I don't think we plan color, and so I think throughout the movie, my approach had been I didn't want to do like a sort of a color trajectory, so I wanted it to be more spastic in a way, spasmodic in a way. So, you know, the red kind of appears in different moments, the white appears in different moments. And so the red was, you know, it was to me anchored both by her grief and also by her yearning for freedom. You know, her mother represented freedom for her. You know, this was again an independent woman who chose to leave her husband, and we envisage her in red, you know. So when Aretha comes to dinner and presents her first husband, saying, "Hey, he's actually coming to dinner. He's going to have dinner with us," and she's wearing red, you know. I also love sort of this idea that her preacher father infuses on her, which is sort of like scarlet being the color of shame, right? You know, like I think all of the things that all of the tropes, the color tropes that we put on women, sort of like I kind of played with that there. And then I think towards the end, you know, we will see that when she's also at her lowest, she's wearing this red caftan. It's a very, very, very short scene. She's kind of splayed out in the chaise, and she's wearing red too. And then the visitation of her mother. I always love that because like different people say, oh, it's a hallucination or it's a visitation, you know. And I love that it's vague like that. Like, did she
Mhm.
actually come? You
Was
know?
she there? Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Well, how about those famous moments and like the MSG concert and then the recording of Amazing Grace, like those real moments, like what went into reimagining those outfits?
Um, I mean, it had a lot to do with Jennifer and sort of scaling Jennifer so that uh, she was able to channel Aretha, but her own Aretha, right? So reinvent her embodiment in that way. So a lot of that was that, but also, you know, I think those two scenes that you mentioned were sort of gargantuan tasks. You know, the MSG moment, we had like over 1,000 extras that I had to dress in like 1968 clothing, and so it was just a ton of research, a ton of like excellent costumers, and like it takes a nation to create like a film like this, you know. In like 3 cities we had like makers in New York, and we were shooting those 2 scenes in Atlanta, and so, you know, I owe a deep gratitude to the wonderful costumers in Atlanta and the craft makers there, you know? So
Mhm.
it took a village. I don't know,
Yeah.
a nation. It took a nation.
Well, I also love like because it ends on like her recording Amazing Grace and that like turquoise like caftan, like it was so striking. It was like this is like the perfect like image to like end the movie on as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was a lot of pressure because the documentary had just come out when we started prep for the movie, right? So I think it was fresh in people's minds. And also, I think, I wanted to tweak it a little bit so that Jennifer had ownership over it. So the color is it's different, the cut of the kaftan is different, but it closely resembles what Aretha wore. We clearly played with the scale. So Jennifer, who is, much taller than Aretha, look in scale with that. But then it was actually looking at the documentary, which was really helpful, and replicating all of those characters, like the film crew and what the family wore, and it was looking at that and making sure that we get that sort of right, because that's sort of the only way I thought we could honor that particular scene with that particular character. And when we shot that, it was church. Jennifer sang so many songs for so long, and Liesel and Kramer, our director of photography, just kept on shooting. Like it was like there's so much footage that is like it was literally church.
That could be like an own documentary. So
yes.
Well, what is your favorite Aretha song?
I think. I love that song. I love how what it asks us to do, and and particularly the way we deployed that in the movie. It's such a turning point. That to me is like a sort of magic of movie making. And I'm really biased to the Road to Spanish Harlem because my mother listened to that a lot.
It always comes back to mom. So
yeah, always.
Well, Clint, it was great speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time. And you get to stay on because everyone's coming back.